Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to the first session of the Purdue Extension Fruit Management Webinar Series presented by Hort Conference and Expo. So we'd love to be in person this time of year. Unfortunately, with the circumstances, we're doing the best we can with what we got. So we're going to be online this year and hopefully see all of you at the 2022 in person, right? So welcome again. I'm Karen Mitchell. I'm the Ag and Natural Resources Educator here in Tippecanoe County. And to start us off today, we will be talking with Peter Hirst on crop load after a crop loss. And so we'll go ahead and pass it on to Peter if you're ready.
Yes, I am. Thanks, Karen. And thanks for Karen and Janna for organizing this. Pleasure to be with you. Again, I wish we could all be in person in the normal sense and face-to-face and a little more interactive than this, but still glad that we can meet this way. So let me share my presentation. I've got a few things to talk about what happened with the fruit season last year and what we might expect this year. Okay, is that showing up okay?
Looks good.
Okay, great, thank you. So, crop loss. I'll go over a little bit of the bad news from last year. Like, I know you're all just recovering from it psychologically, but I just want to remind you of that. And hey, we're still all here, right? So, let's see if this is going to play. This is a short video showing the life cycle of an apple tree. If I can get this going. And this shows it from spring. So right now the trees look kind of like this, and it's going to march us through 1 year. And so these are some of the things, well, these are all the things that happen over the course of a year. And so here's a single tree. So in the spring it leaves out, it flowers, it sets fruit, fruits start to grow. This is golden delicious, so it's hard to see the apples. There they are. And so the apples grow throughout the season, then they get ripe and we harvest them and hopefully we make some money. And then towards the end of the year, if we don't harvest them, they fall off and the leaves fall off and we get to winter and then the whole thing starts over again. And so in an annual crop, that's what we'd see. We're not talking about an annual crop here. This is a biennial crop, or it's a perennial crop that lives for many years. And so what happens 1 year can certainly affect what happens the following year. And so, so before the apples are ready to grow this spring, as I sit here in West Lafayette and I look out the window and it's 70 degrees today, so, but you know, it could snow again next week. But, and so what's going on with the trees right now? Well, over the winter, they've accumulated chilling. And so trees require a certain amount of chilling. It's sort of their way of keeping track of time. When's the best time to grow? And so obviously, if we get a few warm days in December, it's not in the tree's best interest to think, oh, it's springtime, well, I should start growing. There needs to be mechanisms to protect the tree from that happening. And one such mechanism is this accumulation of chilling hours. And so some apples require only a few chilling hours to grow. And that would be in the case of some of these apples like Anna, Fuji, Mutsu, Pink Lady, pretty low chilling hours. But most of the varieties that you grow require between 600 and 1,000 hours of chilling. It's not understood very precisely, but most of them are in sort of this window. And we think about what temperatures work best for chilling. And it's very easy to think, well, you know, we had a lot of single digit temperatures. Surely that's enough chilling. But the thing is, temperatures below 32 don't count as far as the tree's concerned. They don't count as far as the accumulation of those chilling hours. And so really temperatures above 32 and below 55 will all work, but the best temperatures are around 36 to 48 degrees Fahrenheit. And so that's when the trees accumulate the most chilling. And someone's going to say, well, we went for a month and it never got above, well, maybe not a month, maybe went for 2 weeks and it never got above freezing. Well, yeah. And so for 2 weeks, the trees didn't accumulate any chilling hours at all. But then we get into these 40-degree days and we accumulate quite a lot of chilling. So that's the way that the tree keeps track of chilling hours and when it's best to grow. And so right now the trees are sitting like in number one. This is from a publication that Janna put together a couple of years ago, showing the different stages of apple growth. And so right now we're still at this dormant stage, right? And so chilling's been fulfilled. And so all we need for the trees to start growing now is accumulation of some warm temperatures. And so then we go from dormant, and we talk about these different stages. So I wanted to show a picture of it just to make sure we're all on the same page. So when we talk about tight cluster or pink or petal fall, we're all talking about the same thing. And so we go from dormant, then we go from silver tip, where these buds are just starting to grow, just a little bit of silver showing on some of these buds. Then we go to green tip, and guess what? Yeah, we have green tips to these buds. Then we go to half-inch green, pretty straightforward. I guess if we ever convert to the metric system, we'll be on 1 centimeter green, but let's not worry about that. Then we go to tight cluster, where the flower clusters are visible, but they haven't opened yet. So they're still very, very tight. All these flowers are joined together on the cluster. Then we go to pink, where some of the pink from the petals are starting to show. Then we go to bloom, obviously when we have flowers open. Then petal fall, when most of the petals are fallen off. And then we get to fruit set later on, okay? So how fast we go from dormant through these various stages through to petal fall and fruit set depends almost entirely on temperature. So if we had a really warm spring and it warmed up and every day was 70 degrees and the sky was blue and life was perfect, we would go through these stages really quickly. But that doesn't happen in Indiana, at least not in my experience. What happens is we'll have a few 70-degree days and it'll move things along quickly, and then it'll drop down into the 30s or 40s for a week, and things basically are in suspended animation. Things just will stop at whatever stage it's at because we're not accumulating enough heat units for it to drive the process forward. So again, all this is dependent on temperature. So one of the problems that we have is that it starts to warm up, and today is a really good example of that, right? Is towards the end of winter and spring is almost here, and today feels like a spring day. It's 70 degrees here in West Lafayette, and the problem is that trees will start to develop and grow. That's not a problem. The problem is if it gets cold again, we can get cold injury to the trees. And so the amount of cold injury we get for a given temperature depends on many factors, but one of the prime factors is the stage of development. For example, look at silvertip, okay? Remember, that's when the buds are just starting to grow, just a little bit of silver showing. If we get down into single digits, we're going to get significant damage to the tree and to the buds. But at pink, for instance, so we're getting close to bloom time, 25 degrees will cause the same amount of damage. So you can see as this process goes through, as plants develop in the spring, they get much more sensitive to cold temperatures. Fortunately, as we go through, the likelihood of cold temperatures diminishes. It never goes to zero. There's always a likelihood of something happening. And so in terms of accumulating growing degree days, and these are the number of growing degree days above 50 degrees. And generally that's accepted as the point above that, and it's going to start to encourage development of the buds. Less than that, they're not really going to develop very much. So if we look at them, I've called it normal, maybe long-term average will be a better way of putting it. This is the long-term average for Lafayette. And typically, we don't start accumulating growing degree days until mid-April, and then they take off pretty quickly, and then spring and summer take over. So that's the long-term average. Doesn't mean that ever happens, but it's the average of what's happened over a long period of time. If we look at the last 10 years, sorry, let me back up a little bit. And so if these curves develop earlier than that, it means we're at more risk of frost damage, of freeze damage, because plants will be at a more sensitive stage of development if cold hits. And of course, the later we get in the season, the risk of a frost in May or June is much less than it is in April. And so if this development is delayed, or the more it's delayed, the lower risk. Okay? It doesn't mean no risk, as we'll see in just a moment. So this is what we've seen over the last 10 years or so. remember, here's our normal curve in green right over on the right-hand side of the screen. I hope you see it there. These are the various years that we've had, and I've just plotted these out from weather station data over the last 10 years. This is in Lafayette. If we plotted it out from your location, you'd probably see something fairly similar. Obviously, in the southern part of the state, it tends to be earlier, and northern part tends to be a bit later. But similar trends will probably be shown. Okay, so a couple of things to point out here. The first is, all of the last 10 years have been earlier than normal, okay? And some of them a lot earlier than normal. And so that means increased risk of frost damage. And many of you may still be paying for the therapy sessions you received in 2012. And in 2012, it warmed up very early, okay? So about this time of the year, for instance. And it stayed warm for a long time. And we accumulated growing degree days like nobody's business, really early in the season. And you know, all the college students thought this is wonderful, of course. But the seasoned fruit growers, the more it went on, the more nervous they got. And someone asked me, what do you think of these temperatures? And I said, well, it's kind of like a guy that jumps out of a 10-story building and he gets about 8 floors down and they say, how's it going? He says, so far, so good. But the ground's approaching quickly. And we all know how that ended. It didn't end well. We had a freeze and we had virtually an entire apple crop in the state was lost. And one grower told me it was the worst year that he could remember. And this guy had been growing fruit for 70 years. And so it was a pretty bad year, being so early. But you see a bunch of these early years. Look at last year. Last year's in this thick black line, okay? It wasn't particularly early. And we warmed up, and then we sort of leveled off for quite a while, and then it warmed up a bit more, okay? So nothing particularly abnormal. In fact, early on, we thought, oh, this is getting towards one of our later years in the last few years. This is looking pretty good. But then what happened? We got hit 3 times. There were a couple of frosts, April 15 to 17, so right in this period right here. And then we had another late frost on May the 9th, and it got into the lower 20s. And those 3 events in succession wiped out about 80% of the apple crop in the state. So not a happy ending to that, even though the temperatures were certainly not outstanding compared to the last 10 years. And so you can never tell where you are or what's likely to happen, but the later the season develops, typically the lower the risk. But last year, that came back to bite us. And so we get to stages like this. This is a tight cluster, and at this stage, frost or freeze damage will still kill those developing flowers. You can see these flowers, there's 5 of them typically in a cluster, and they're all still pretty tight. And so at this stage, they're still susceptible quite susceptible to freeze damage. Once they open, let me go back a little bit. The most sensitive part of the flower is the pistil, right on the inside in the ovary, okay? And that the pistil is where the pollen lands and grows down. It fertilizes the eggs in the ovary to make a seed, okay? And without seeds, typically we don't get fruit development. So when they're tight like this, they have some protection because these inner parts of the flower have these leaves and bud scales over them still to offer them some sort of protection and trap some air around there, so they have a little bit of insulation. Once we get to this point, here are our pistils. I don't know if you can see them, but they're right in the middle of this open flower in the middle of the screen. And so this is where the pollen will be deposited and grow down here. And if these are killed, then there's not going to be fruit, fruit set. There's not going to be seed set. There won't be fruit development. So at this stage, we're really sensitive to cold damage. So even at a tight cluster, and this is a cross-section of a pink lady flower, and I took these back in 2002 when we had that severe freeze. And here you can see the various parts of the flower quite nicely. And so here's our flower developing. You can see our big sacs of pollen, our anthers in this flower. You can see our pistils in the middle, and this is where the pollen would land, and it'll grow all the way down here to the ovule. And maybe you can see the ovule at the base of the flower, and those eggs will then turn into seeds. And it's this tissue around here that'll turn into our flower, into our fruit rather. So this receptacle tissue right around the ovule, that's what's going to turn into our fruit. However, when it gets cold, this is what we saw that year. And so on the outside, you know, you can see the pink of the petals. It'll all look pretty nice. And we waited for a few days and went out and looked at it. And from a distance, it looks like, oh yeah, these flowers look okay. But you start cutting them and you see a lot of damage exactly like this. And so you can see all those flower parts are dead, and there's that fruit is not going to develop. And so those flowers then are just going to dry up and drop off. So this was taken last year, okay? And so our last freeze hit on May 9, and these photos were taken on May 19. And here we see some of these developing fruitlets. You know, here's our receptacle, and maybe they look a little dark, but don't look too bad until we start to cut some open. So I cut some open and put them on my truck out in the field and took some photos of them, okay? Just took a photo with my phone. And so this is what these fruitlets look like on top from the outside. When I cut these same fruitlets in half, you can see on the inside, see the seeds, developing seeds there? They're all brown. Those seeds are not going to develop. Those fruit are not going to develop. And so severe damage because of that. Even the fruit that did survive were badly scarred. And so this is the kind of damage that we often see with freeze damage. Even if it doesn't kill the fruit, this fruit has rusted on the outside caused by damage to those cells. And so now this has become, rather than a saleable apple, it's typically a cider apple. And so it's probably lost, I don't know, 90% of its value because of that. So even the fruit that did survive are not really worth very much. And this creates all kinds of problems for the grower, obviously. And so if you've ever looked at the small print on an investment account or your 401k or anything like that, you see past performance is no guarantee of future results. And so it is with the fruit business, right? So whatever happened last year may not influence too much of this year. So let's look forward a little bit and think about what can we expect this year going forward. So let's take it from where we are right now. And this is sort of my crystal ball of what we can expect going forward. And I'll point out some points along the way where we can intervene in terms of managers of those trees and where we can intervene with some management strategies. So we usually accumulate enough winter chilling. That's usually not a problem. And so the only thing needed now for growth is warm temperatures. And so the more the trees develop, the more cold sensitive they become. So we've talked about that. And so, so what we should hope for is that the 70-degree weather that we have today is not going to last. It might be nice for us getting outside, but in terms of the risk profile of our trees, this is not what we want, because this is going to promote those trees to start growing, get to a more cold sensitive stage early. We want that to happen late when the risk of cold is lower. And so we'd hope for a few more weeks, maybe another month or more of cool temperatures. So preferably lower than 50 or 60. At those temperatures, development is going to be very slow. So at this point, we want to slow the process down because we don't want to get into that cold sensitive stage too quickly. So in terms of fruit development, let's talk about how flowers develop, because when the trees start growing, those flowers are going to emerge. But those flowers, they actually, the process of development of those flowers actually started last year. So what happened last year? Well, those buds perceived some signal in the bud. We're starting to understand a little more what we think those signals are. They cause the buds to develop. They cause flowers to form in the buds, and typically this happens in July and August. While those buds are still small, they just look like buds to us. Then they overwinter, which they've just done, and then probably in April this year, we'll see flowers that'll get pollinated. The cells in the receptacle will divide and turn into a fruit, so we get all these cells. They'll divide, so we get more and more cells. Then those cells will get larger and larger, until we have a fruit sometime in August, September, October this year. So this entire process, this is a 2-year process, development of this fruit that we're going to harvest this year. And the process started last summer, okay? So we're about halfway through this process. We're right at this point, this halfway point. And so typically what happens with biennial bearing, and we're going to talk a bit about that because that's a real danger for us right now, is, and this is an old diagram out of a book, but it shows the trend pretty clearly, is we'll have a climatic trigger. And on May the 9th last year, we had a climatic trigger. Okay, we had temperature in the lower 20s. It killed a bunch of developing flowers. So we had very low yield last year. So we had an off year. Okay, so in terms of the trees producing apples, it was off. Okay, and so what happened? Well, the trees produced a lot of flowers for the next year, this year. Okay, so those flowers were produced last year when the trees had very little fruit on them. They produced a lot of flowers that are going to open in the next month or so here. And so then we expect an on year and an off year, on year and off year. So that's what happens in a very in a cultivar of apple that's very prone to biennial bearing, something like Honeycrisp or Fuji. On a more regular bearing apple, we can still have the climatic trigger, but it doesn't swing so much. It still might oscillate a little bit from year to year, but it's more regular bearing. And that would be something like a gala, for instance. But with our management intervention, what we're trying to do, we couldn't affect the off year last year. The frost took care of that for us. But what we can do is try to get these trees into a more regular pattern. And so that's what we'll be talking about today, is what can you do to try to assume that more regular pattern. And so we don't want to see this, okay? And come spring, this is biennial bearing pretty starkly. These are golden delicious trees. Some trees are on, right? They have a ton of flowers on them. And some trees are off, hardly any flowers at all. And it could be trees within an orchard, like we see here, some trees on and some trees off, or it could be a whole orchard. And I would expect this spring, we're going to see a lot of trees like this one at the front with just a ton of flowers on it because they were off last year because of the freeze. And so let's talk a little bit about biennial bearing. So it has negative effects in the orchard. You're going to say, yeah, you're telling me it has negative effects in the orchard. You should have seen my bank account. Absolutely. And so it can affect fruit size, it can affect quality, it can affect bitter pit, it affects the continuity of yield from year to year. Fruit also may set in bunches. And so when fruit is very bunchy and you have a lot of fruit together, as they grow, they can push each other off. And this is very true for fruit that have very short stems. Something like a Macintosh should be typical of that. Biennial bearing is very genotype dependent, and we just talked about that. Some cultivars tend to be very biennial. In fact, some of the newer high-value cultivars, like Honeycrisp, Fuji, Cameo, Brabant, they tend to be very biennial. And when you have a high-cost orchard system, like many of us are going to these days, so we're no longer, probably our newer plantings aren't the low-cost, low-density, low productivity systems like we used to plant, 30, 40 years ago. They tend to be very intensive systems, maybe tall spindle with a lot of trees per acre, maybe posts and trellis and wires. And I mean, there's a lot of cost in establishing these orchards. And so the more cost involved in orchard establishment, the greater the financial penalty of missing a crop early in the life of that orchard, because you're hoping for those early crops to help pay for it. And so because of all these factors, I would suggest that biennial bearing is becoming a bigger challenge as time goes on. And so I think it's a bigger challenge now than it has been for a long time. And I haven't even factored in here climate change. And we've seen the last 10 years have been earlier than the long-term average. You'd expect some to be earlier and later. Every one of them's been earlier. And so where do we intervene? Okay, so here's last year, 2020. Here we are this year. This is what we expect, 2021. Well, in the off year, there's really nothing you can do because the freeze has killed a bunch of those flowers. The trees are growing. All you can do is manage the trees. You can't stick the flowers back on. This year, we're going to have a ton of flowers on those trees. This is the year to do something about it. And so for many orchards in the state, management of those trees this spring is going to be really critical. So this is what I would expect many folks to see this spring. So here's a tree and it's just covered in flowers. Just about every bud is flowering. And so we have the potential to set a huge crop of fruit. And if we set a huge crop of fruit, next year we're probably going to be low and then high and low and perpetuate this pattern. And that's not what we want. We want this even pattern to even it out from year to year. And so, so this is what we see. And so this spring, I expect to see a ton of flowers. And on those flowers, when they open, here you can see the pistils at the middle of the flower. See those pistils? And this is where the bee is going to visit. She's going to deposit pollen on that stigmatic surface. That pollen's going to germinate, grow down here, and fertilize the ovule to produce seeds. And so there's a diagram of that. Here's our bee, and our bee's busy doing her work and spreading the pollen around the orchard. And we did a study on pollination. When I say we, you know, at university we like to say we did it. Actually, my graduate student did all the work, but those of you that know me know that's true anyway. And so this is what, Khalil did some really nice work and published a nice paper on this. And he published it in a journal called Hort Science and made the cover. That was kind of a big deal. And so see this top circle, these specks are pollen grains germinating on the stigmatic surface. So on the surface of that pistil right at the top. And you can see all those pollen grains germinating. Once they germinate, they grow, and they grow down in a tube down the style to the ovary. And you see all these pollen grains growing down these tubes. And once that happens and it fertilizes the ovule to produce seeds, then we end up with something like this. And this is soon after flowering. You can see these seeds starting to develop. You see all these cells around here in the receptacle. And they grow throughout the season. And here they are in the photo on the bottom, showing all these cells dividing, and then they're going to expand. And so all these processes we expect to go on and take place. So the pollination period is very critical. So after flowers open and they get pollinated, that ovule is only receptive to pollen for a certain period of time. And so really the pollen has got to reach that ovule while the ovule is still receptive. And so so if we have if the embryo is receptive for 8 days, but say it's nice and warm in the spring and it takes 2 days for the pollen to grow down the style to get there, that gives us a 6-day window, effective pollination period. Gives a 6-day window for the bee to deposit the pollen. It's going to take 2 days to get there, and it gets there just in time. Perfect, okay? And so that's a pretty wide window. Let's say it's a little bit cooler in the spring and it takes 4 days for the pollen to grow down the style. And the rate of growth of that pollen down the style is almost entirely dependent on temperature. Let's say our flowers are not quite as strong. They're only receptive for 6 days. It takes 4 days to grow there. We've only now got a 2-day window. Ooh, the bees better get on and pollinate those flowers early because we don't have much time up our sleeve. But if pollen tube growth takes 4 days, and maybe the embryo's only receptive for 3 days, well, we have 1 day here, right? And so then the window is shrinking and shrinking. And so a warm spring really benefits us in getting good pollination and a lot of seed set, potential for high quality fruit. Again, we can't control that, but by knowing about this, we can adjust our management to deal with this. When we have uneven pollination, and here's some examples of fruit with uneven pollination, where on one side of the fruit we have a good-sized seed, on the other side we have a seed that hasn't been fertilized, so it's just a seed remnant. And we tend to get misshapen fruit, like this one on the left, where it grows a lot more on one side, where it has seeds, and less on the other side, where it has fewer seeds. Okay, so it benefits us to have really good pollination. And generally, the more seeds you have, the larger and better quality that fruit is going to be. So we want to do everything we can to get good pollination. And that includes bringing in bees. And so let's assume we've done all that, right? The bees have done their job. We had a nice warm spring. You know, the sun's shining, the sky's blue, and life is good. And then we go out and we look at this and we're like, oh my, there's a lot of potential fruit on these trees. Well, what do we do now? Well, I'm glad you asked, because there is something you can do now. And so hopefully we end up in this situation where we don't have any freezes this year. We have good pollinating weather. The bees are very active, and we end up where we've just got way too many flowers on our tree, and we can reduce them. And that process is called fruit thinning. And that's something that we need to do in the spring. So we'll talk more about that. Once we get to this stage, of all the flowers on the tree, we only need between 2 and 5% of those flowers to form fruit to have a full crop. So if we have 30%, 40%, 50% of those flowers pollinated and set fruit, we've got way, way too many, okay? And so you can see in this picture, if all of these fruit are left to develop, then in this, I don't know, maybe 1 foot section of branch, we could have maybe 10 apples, and we probably want 2. So we have way too many. And so what happens at this point is basically all these fruit are growing and they need energy to grow, okay, carbohydrates. Well, where do these carbohydrates come from? Well, in the spring, they come from 2 places. They come from storage in the tree, stored over from last year, which is pretty minimal supply. And they come from photosynthesis in these leaves that they're producing in the spring. But at this time of the year, when we have all these developing fruit, so all these mouths to feed, we have limited leaf area because the leaves are just getting going, right? The shoots aren't really growing yet. We just have those small spur leaves. So our leaf area is limited. So, you know, leaves are essentially small solar panels. And so the area of our solar panel is small, so our energy production is pretty limited, and there's not enough to go around. So what happens if we just don't do anything? Well, there's a shortage in carbohydrate because the leaf area is not great enough to supply all those fruit with their needs. So some of them are going to miss out. And it's the law of the jungle, right? Survival of the fittest. And so some of these are going to fall off. And so we have what's called June drop. And that's where the ones that lose out in that competition, they don't get enough resources to grow, they're going to drop off the tree. That's a natural process. That's going to happen if you do nothing to those trees. That's a natural process, and that's going to happen. That's a good thing, because typically we have way too many developing fruitlets on the tree. But the unfortunate thing is the fruit drop is not enough to get the crop load down to the level that we want so we can produce good quality fruit. So it comes down to energy in and energy out, okay? And so fruit thinning, and this is where we adjust the crop load so we end up with a still a nice crop, but of good quality fruit. So you can perform this manually. This is expensive. Typically you do it later, so it doesn't work as well. You have a lot more control though, and you can be selective. So if there's damaged fruit, you can remove those. If there's misshapen fruit, you can remove those. But it's also extremely labor intensive. If you have 1 tree in your yard, this is the way to do it. If you have more than about 2 or 3 trees, it just becomes impossible. And if you have thousands of trees or acres of trees, then it is impossible. And so then you have to resort to chemical thinning. Chemical thinning is certainly cheaper. You can conduct it earlier, but it also comes with a lot more risk. When you hand thin, you know exactly how many you're taking off. When you chemical thin and you spray on these chemicals on the tree to make some of the fruit fall off, you never know whether you're going to get it too much, too little, just right. But it is much more labor efficient. And so if the number of trees that you're growing is measured in acres rather than the number of trees that you can count on one hand, then this is what you have to do, okay? And so chemical thinning, there's 2 basic types. There's bloom thinners, and these are ones that are applied during bloom. And typically they interfere with the pollination process. And so, and that is the sort of thinners that are applied in many places like Washington State, for instance. There's also post-bloom thinners. This is after fruit have set, So the pollen's already reached the ovule, fertilized the ovule, produced seeds. Now we're going to apply our thinners, and it's going to cause some of those fruit to drop. So these are post-bloom thinners, okay? And they act in a different way. Okay, so what's the advantages and disadvantages? Bloom thinners, for us in Indiana, I just think it's too risky. In some years, it will work great, and it'll do a great job. You'll have great effect, thin fantastically, get a great crop, perfect. But the problem is, what happens if you thin at bloom, say mid-April, you go out there and you thin, and let's say all the stars align, and you do a perfect job, and you've got the exact right number of fruit on the tree that you want. And after, you spray your thinner on, you wait 2 or 3 weeks for it to work, and you go back and you look at your trees and you're like, this is perfect. This worked out just great. I've got exactly the number I wanted. So that's mid-April, right? At bloom time. May 9th last year, what happened? We had a freeze, right? And it killed a bunch of fruit. What happens if we have a freeze after you thin and you've got just the right number and half of them are killed off? Well, now you've only got half as many as what you wanted. So now you're in a real tight spot. Your yield is only going to be half of what you wanted it to be. The later you leave the thinning, you can adjust. So if you have a freeze and it kills a lot of fruit, you might decide I don't need to thin at all. You can adjust your strategy the later you leave it, right? But the later you leave it, they don't work as well. So you have the best effect early. You don't have as good effect late, but your risk is lower. So how do you make that judgment call, right? Between earliness and good effect, but at high risk, or later, you don't quite get the same results, but the risk is a lot lower. Well, we'll talk a bit about that, how you can sort of have a little bit of a foot in each camp there. So the carbohydrate theory is all about just not enough food to go around. We already talked about that. And so basically our post-bloom thinners, and I'm going to focus on that because I think bloom thinning is just too risky for most of us in Indiana. And so I think post-bloom thinning is where it makes sense to be. There's 3 main categories of post-bloom thinners. And all of them swing this. Let me go back one slide. Remember I said about the carbohydrate theory, the law of the jungle, where there's not enough food to go around? All of these thinners sway the balance in terms of less and less food to go around. So more and more fruit are going to miss out and going to drop off. So it's going to increase abscission, the number of fruit that drop off, okay? But they do it in different ways. So NAA, okay, naphthalene acetic acid is the active ingredient, and these are materials like fructose N, right? It's very dose dependent, and it reduces photosynthesis for a short period of time. When you reduce photosynthesis in those leaves, you're going to decrease the supply of carbohydrate, so more of the fruit are going to miss out on that competition, so more of them are going to drop off. Then we have our materials that have cytokinin in them, 6-benzyladenine. And these are materials like Maxell. And this is a much milder thinner. What it does, it increases respiration in the fruit. So fruit are respiring, right? They're burning up energy. And so if you increase respiration, they're burning up energy faster, which means they have an increased demand for carbohydrate. There's less left over, so it increases the competition, more fruit drop off, okay? Our third category is Carbaryl, which is also an insecticide, and most people are familiar with 7. It's not very dose dependent, and what this does, it decreases translocation. Okay, so the transport of sugars from our leaves to our fruit, well, the transport is slowed down, so it's decreased, which means less supply of carbohydrate to the fruit, more shortfall of carbohydrate, more fruit are going to miss out, more are going to drop off, okay? So 3 different strategies. There are some other compounds as well, but these are the 3 main ones that most growers will use in the state. And sometimes they'll use a combination of these as well. So not all varieties thin the same. And so it's not like you're going to load up your sprayer with a certain concoction and you're going to spray your orchard from one end to the other. Most growers will not do that. They'll go out and they'll assess and they'll say, you know, yeah, they're all and this spring, I expect everything to flower very heavily. But growers will know that my Fuji, they're much more difficult to thin, so I need to be a bit more aggressive on those. But if I apply that same aggressive spray to my Macintosh or my Red Delicious or my Honeycrisp, then it might over-thin them. And so I'm going to adjust how aggressive I'm going to be according to how easy or difficult to thin a particular cultivar is. These are in certain categories, but the thing is with thinning, and please don't ask me why, because I don't have a good explanation, but I know it's true, is that varieties on different farms respond differently. And so what works in your farm is not the same as what works for someone else. And so it's not a recipe approach. I can't tell everyone to go out and apply 10 parts per million of NAA at 10 millimeter fruit size, and that'll do the perfect job. It doesn't work like that. Everyone's farm's different because everyone's trees are different. We prune them differently. The spurs, the strength of the spurs is different. I mean, there's a lot of differences. And so you need to learn what works on your particular farm. So what determines how effective a chemical thinner would be? Number one is fruit diameter. And this is data from Rich Marini at Penn State. And he went out and tagged hundreds, maybe thousands of fruitlets and looked and to see what caused them to drop off when. And so number one thing is fruit diameter. So typically we target when fruit diameter is 10 to 12 millimeters. Okay, so almost a ½ inch diameter of the fruit. So that's sort of the stage that we're often looking at. Number two determinant of effectiveness of a chemical thinner is the minimum temperature 2 days before treatment. Minimum temperature 1 day, minimum temperature day of treatment, minimum temperature 1 day after treatment. Okay, and so these temperatures can be very important. But it's not quite as simple. I mean, nothing simple with thinning. But it's not just saying certain temperatures are important. It depends on the fruit size. And so small fruit, so less than 10 millimeters, their response to thinners is not particularly influenced by temperature or influenced less. Whereas fruit, once they get a bit larger, maybe 12, 14, 16 millimeter, they need warmer temperatures for those thinners to work. And so by warmer temperatures, I mean, 65, 70, maybe 75. But certainly warmer temperatures, the larger fruit get. So there's a lot of things involved in how well thinners work. And unfortunately, it's a real complex mix that we quite frankly just don't understand very well. And so what growers need to do is develop a picture of what works best on their particular farm. And so this is my advice for this year, okay? We expect snowball bloom. We expect very heavy bloom on most of our trees. So get ready, okay? Make sure you're all ready to go. You want to be on the aggressive side with your thinners. And we'll talk more about why that is in just a minute. As I mentioned just a moment ago, experience on your farm is very important. And so you may want to thin at sort of the aggressive end of the scale, but what's aggressive for you on your farm may be very different to your friend who's farming 20 miles away on their farm. And so develop a picture for your own farm. And so tweak your practices from year to year, okay? I would say keep notes of what works for you on your farm, okay? Everyone thinks, oh yeah, I'll remember and I'll take that into account next year. Well, there's 365 days between this year and next year. And if you're like me, I don't remember what I had for breakfast. I do remember what I have for breakfast because I have the same thing every day. But apart from that, take notes so you can remember because there's a lot of things happen. And so the sort of things you want to record is, what did you apply? Did you apply 10 millimeters or 100, whatever the rate was of what material and on what date, and what was the stage of tree development? Did you apply it at petal fall? Did you apply it at 12 millimeter fruitlet diameter? What was the stage of development? And also, what was the temperature when you applied it? And so watch the temperature carefully. Typically, when it's too cool, thinners don't work very well. And so I would say this year, you probably want to start pretty early. And I would start at petal fall, okay? You don't want to apply Carbohydrate or 7 while you have open flowers on the trees. Why? Well, it's also an insecticide. And there's some insects in the trees, bees, that if they're there and you apply 7, you're going to kill a bunch of bees. That's not what we want to do. That doesn't make anyone happy. And so you want to start early this year, okay? So start at petal fall. And don't think you're going to get the job done with one shot. You're going to go out and give it one shot and you're going to be done. I wouldn't take that approach. I would go out at petal fall with the idea that you're going to wait a couple of weeks and then assess the situation and then follow up if you need to. That's one reason to start at petal fall, to give yourself enough time for that follow-up before the fruitlets are too big. And so, so we call this a nibble approach, whereas rather than a one-shot deal, we're going to nibble away at it and we're going to get it done in successive sprays.
Peter?
So wait a couple of weeks to estimate the thinning response.
Peter?
Yes.
Can I ask a question for one of the people from the chat?
Certainly.
Melanie McQuinn wanted to know if there were any thinners that were sanctioned for organic use.
Thinners for organic use is difficult. The organic growers are in a real bind here with chemical thinners. The only one that the organic growers I know of in other states bloom thin using salt. You know, we could have a long discussion how environmentally friendly that is, but it's organic. But the thing is, salt solutions only work when they're applied at bloom time, okay? Because what they do, those pistils in the flowers, remember those little threads where the pollen lands on and grows down? The salt dries those out, and so it kills a bunch of them. That's a really high-risk approach for us in Indiana and our conditions. And so, unfortunately, there isn't a good answer to that question, Melanie. You know, organic growers have fewer tools at their disposal for tree management in total, but especially for thinning. So salt is the only one I know of, but again, that's a bloom thinner and that's a risky approach. And so what I think what I would probably do in that situation is once the trees start blooming, and I'd wait till bloom is fairly well on the way through. And so you think that you've already got a bunch of fruit that have been fertilized, you know, the ovules have been fertilized, fruit set. Then you can come in and apply salt to stop any future open flowers setting fruit. So stop those ones, because they don't all do it at the same time. But timing is going to be really important there. So it's a good question. Unfortunately, I don't have a good answer for you. But timing is going to be really important there. Okay. So we're starting at petal fall. We're not looking at a one-shot deal. We're using the nibble approach. Yeah, wait a couple of weeks to estimate the thinning response. The real danger is that you apply thinners and you wait a week and you go out and you think, well, that didn't really do much. I'm going to give it another shot. Well, it usually takes a couple of weeks to see the full response. If you go in after a week, it may well be that you got it just right, but you just can't see it yet. Then you apply some more, then you're going to overthin. But I would say that underthinning is much worse than overthinning. Growers tend to get very concerned, and I understand it, with overthinning their crop. But underthinning is actually a bigger risk, I think. So let's look at that a little bit. Let's look at what some of the effects might be. If you overthin, right, you overdo the job, you get too aggressive, and you thin too many fruit off the tree. What happens? Well, this year you get low yield, right? Because you dropped a lot of fruit off, more fruit than water. But the fruit that remain are going to be large. They're going to have high sugar concentration. Trees probably have too much vigor. You can manage that with materials like apogee, but you're going to have vigorous trees. You may have bitter pit in some of your fruit, especially on prone varieties like Honeycrisp. You'll have really good return bloom because you have a low crop. And really what you've done, you've compromised this year's crop, okay? Because the crop wasn't as large as what you'd like. It's good quality, but the yield was low. Let's look at underthinning. If you underthin this year, you know, you weren't aggressive enough. You didn't go in hard enough, and you left way too many fruit on the tree. What happens? Well, you have high yield, right? A lot of apples left on the trees. But the fruit are going to be small. They're not going to be very tasty. Low sugar concentration. Trees might be pretty low vigor, maybe on the verge of getting runted out, and so not enough vigor. you're probably going to have poor return bloom next year, right? And so what you've done, you've compromised 2 years' crops. This year's crop, because you have lousy quality, and next year's crop, because you had poor return bloom. So if you look at it in those contexts, you can see that if you had to, I mean, obviously you're trying to get it just right in the middle, right? You know, is the porridge too hot, too cold, or just right? Well, we'd like it just right. But if you had to choose one or other of these scenarios, I think you'd think, well, over-thinning, yeah, I want to avoid that, but it's not the worst problem in the world. Under-thinning, that puts me in a real bind, you know, especially if you get into the end of May or June, all the fruit are an inch in diameter. There's no chemical thinners that are going to work at that point. It's going to cost too much money, and you don't have enough labor to do it by hand. And you know that you've sacrificed this year's crop, fruit are going to be small, and maybe lack of return bloom next year. So again, think carefully about that. So what do you do this year? Okay, we want to be more aggressive than in the past, I think, because we expect very high flowering this year. So start early at petal fall. And so a spray like 7 plus Ethifon at petal fall, that would be really aggressive, okay? 7 or Maxell, or maybe a combination at petal fall, that would be pretty aggressive, but maybe something you want to consider. 7 and or Maxell at 12 millimeter, that'll be kind of like a standard kind of a program, okay? So earlier thinning, you get better return bloom and larger fruit size. And so the take-home message in 2021, this year, be prepared for snowball bloom, a lot of bloom, and be prepared to thin early and aggressively, okay? That's the take-home message. And so hopefully you have crop that's going to look like this on your trees. And so my last slide, I'd say stay tuned to Facts of Fancy Fruit. We'll keep you updated throughout the year and make suggestions there. You can subscribe online. If you can't remember this, which I don't, I always just go to Google and type in Purdue FFF, and it's the first one that comes up. And that'll take you to the Facts of Fancy Fruit page. If you look at the bottom of the page, you'll see subscribe to Facts of Fancy Fruit. If you click on that button, you can enter your name and your email. It's a free subscription. And every time new articles get published, they'll come straight to your email box. So I see that we have a couple of questions in the chat box. And so I'm going to stop my share and look at that and see if there's any other questions. If you do have other questions, feel free to enter them in the chat box, and we can address those.
Thank you, Peter. That was a great reminder, especially for a year like this, where we're probably going to have quite a bloom and also other various problems. One question that was in the chat box that I just want to make sure we will be covering the Brood X cicada question next session. So there are 2 more sessions going to be following this. So we'll cover that with our Elizabeth Long next week. The other question that was up there and was, when do you begin record chilling hours?
Yeah, we typically start recording at leaf fall, okay? So as soon as the leaves are off the tree in, November, I guess, that's when you can start recording them. And so usually chilling hours is not a problem for us. And so at about this time of the year, we expect that chilling has been fulfilled. I haven't done the calculation, so perhaps I'll do it and I'll put something in Facts of Fancy Fruit. But at this time of the year, our attention starts turning towards growing degree days, because chilling's been fulfilled. All we're waiting on is enough warm days to get the plants going in the spring. And so the base that we typically use is 50 degrees Fahrenheit. And so if the daily average is 60, so 60 minus 50 is 10. So we accumulated 10 growing degree days today. And so that's how we do the calculation. It's not precise, but it gets us in the right ballpark and lets us know, make some predictions on tree development.
Very good. So another question that we had was, how did the drought last year impact our fruit trees?
Yeah, I think I think the drought was probably a good thing for us last year on fruit trees because we had very low yields, right? Most of our trees had hardly any fruit on them. And normally what we'd expect when the trees don't have many fruit, they've got all these leaves, these solar panels collecting this energy. What are they going to do? They're going to grow vegetatively and grow like crazy. That's normally what we'd expect to happen in a year when we didn't have much fruit on the trees. And so we would have expected a lot of vigor. Because we had a drought, I think it helped hold back a lot of that vigor. And so, so it may have actually been a bit of a silver lining for us last year.
Well, that's, I guess, good news. I hear that a drought was had a silver lining to it. So is there anything that growers should do, you know, after having a drought? And
no, I think that just watch for this spring. You know, I expect that we're going to have very heavy flowering. And so just make sure you're ready to go, because the window for thinning is a pretty, you know, timing is really important. And so if you wait till you're ready to thin and then you think, oh man, I need to order some chemical, or I need to make sure my sprayer's working, or you need to do something else, and oh, my sprayer's not working, I need to order a part, it's going to be 2 weeks, and now thinning season is past you, now you're really in trouble. And so I would think that this year, growers are going to have to be really on the ball with thinning. So make sure you have all your ducks in a row, get everything lined up, ready to go. So that's what I would suggest for this coming spring.
Well, very good. So thank you again for joining us. There is no more questions in the chat that I can see.
There was one other question there, Karen.
Privately.
Do all fruit start at base 50?
Oh.
The answer is probably not, but I think that's a good enough approximation to get you in the right ballpark. You know, once you start looking into these things, it gets complicated really quickly. And so our simplistic method of just looking at daily average temperature and subtracting 50, yeah, it's a good ballpark and gets us in the right area. But if you want to be very precise, you better be prepared for it to get complicated, and it does. And so, and some of these things, you know, quite frankly, are not very well understood. And so, but I think you know, using base 50 for most of the crop, for apples and peaches and the things that we grow in the state, is going to get us in the right ballpark.
Well, thank you. So Janna Beckerman has shared the Midwest Fruit Pest Management Guide in the chat. And then I also put Peter's contact info. So that's actually the link to his author information for the Facts for Fancy Fruit. So if you go to that, you'll get his information and all of the many articles that he's written in the past couple of years. So thank you again, Peter.
Sure, thanks.
For joining us today. It is just a couple minutes early, so we will take a few minutes break here to thank our sponsors making this program possible. So we have the grower, the Country Folks Grower, and Norse Farms. And so we'll take a few minutes if Lori would put up that. And if you guys have any further questions, we can continue putting them in the chat. You know, we do have Peter on for just a little bit. Thank you, Lori. So we'll take a few minutes and we'll be back with Janna Beckerman in just a little bit with plant disease, apple disease management.
For over 85 years, Norse Farms has produced and sold premium quality small fruit plants to national and international commercial fruit growers, home gardeners, and resellers. We're committed to providing customers with virus-indexed, highly productive plants. This commitment drives us to stay on the cutting edge of the latest developments in the industry. We identify and test new varieties and growing techniques so that we can stand behind our promise to deliver quality to you. From our on-site lab to our greenhouse, our fields to our packing house, our #1 priority is to ensure that you get the best plants possible. For more information about Norse Farms, visit us at norsefarms.com. Whether you're an experienced grower or first-timer, we're here to help you every step of the way. We look forward to growing with you.
Welcome to those that are joining us to the first session of the Purdue Extension Fruit Management Webinar Series, presented by the Hort Conference, Indiana Hort Conference and Expo. So this is our way to meet without actually meeting. So it's nice that everybody was able to join us on this beautiful day. We will be getting started with our second session here. Janna Beckerman is with us to discuss apple disease management and some of those spray guides that you may have. So, Janna.
All right. So we will get started right here. And one, thank you to Peter for really providing a really nice segue for all of this. You know, a lot of what he talked about was, you know, some of the risks of doing certain management techniques over other risks and, you know, the benefits and the trade-offs. And so when we're thinking about disease management, all of that stuff is the same. It holds true. And how we evaluate those trade-offs has to do with values. And we all have different values, and just, you know, let's try and keep that in mind. And for some people, you know, they are very risk averse or intolerant of risk. Others seem to be able to assume a lot more. And you know, lately it just seems like the risks have just been crazy. I mean, we've had a pandemic. It's just been kind of a crazy time for everyone, and it just seems to keep continuing in that, you know, right now the risk is, will we even have a crop, and what do we do by way of disease management? It's been dry through most of the state. That's actually good news, because that probably means we don't have ascospores flying around. For those of you in the more southern part of the state, you definitely want to spray copper if you're still at silver or just starting at the very beginning of green tip. And in the event, you know, since we don't know where things are going to go, and, you know, last year we lost the crop on May 9th or thereabouts, we want to make sure we don't invest too much money, but at the same time, if we manage to get beyond that window and we do have a crop, we don't want to say, oh gosh, I wish I would have applied more mancozeb, Captan, or something else. So one of the ways to split the differences, you know, by spraying Captan and mancozeb, it's a lot less expensive than some of the systemic fungicides. It will give you very good levels of disease management. And then as you feel more confident, you can, if the need exists, increase what you are applying, and, you know, of course, the cost of which fungicides you're applying. And by that, I mean switching to some of the more modern fungicides that are more expensive, such as Maravon, Luna Sensation, Aprovia, and fungicides like that. Also, just a reminder, there is the disease management of fruit crops after crop loss. Hopefully no one will need that, but it will at least provide you some guidance as to how to manage your crop so you can keep it around till next year and not invest too much in it. So we're going to start with this first case study that I put together, and just to put some pictures, because I mean, we have people who are all at various stages of learning, and I know it's, for many of us, you know, not having fruit last year, maybe we forget the beauty that we have here, which is bitter rot or scab. Over here we have fly speck and sooty blotch. Here we have scab on the fruit. And down below we have cedar apple rust. So these are some of the diseases, but like I had said, I didn't want this to be a normal talk. What I really wanted to do was for this to be a discussion. So this is a grower who is having a lot of problems, and they sprayed. You know, she said she hired a farmer and she doesn't know why things are so bad. So here's actually the spray schedule and what was done. As best as they recorded it. And so I was going to open this up to you guys, either in the chat or if you just want to pipe in by unmuting, as to what you think might be some possible problems here. And, you know, we're all learning, and please weigh in.
Looks like somebody in Marshall County unmuted.
You want to say something?
Do you want to chime in?
Not at this time.
Okay.
So does anybody see a problem with any of these products that they're using? Or maybe there's something they don't personally like and they want to tell us why they don't like it? What about when this person started spraying? Is there any problem with that?
Yeah.
Missing the dormant spray, early copper, things like that is what my group's
I don't
saying.
know what Bradley was.
Awesome. Exactly. So, and I can't see who's actually talking or anything like that. So one of those weird Zoom things, I guess, but yes. So one of the problems, or one of the reasons this group is having, this person was having problems is they didn't start spraying until tight cluster. And let me just, I'm going to hit escape on my talk here, or not. Let's see. Okay, so I'll just go back and forth, I think, then to this slide. So here what we see with this spray program is the grower didn't start spraying until we got to this point. What could be the potential problem of waiting until this point to start spraying? Well, obviously the potential problem is all this, but, or at least some of that. What diseases did we really need to try and manage earlier on that we didn't get because we didn't start spraying until tight cluster?
Marshall County is just saying that the diseases, we're not preventing those diseases from entering those buds by waiting this long. So we're getting the diseases going instead of preventing them or managing them.
That is exactly it, particularly with a disease like apple scab right here. You know, sometimes the scab starts really early, and it is possible once it starts raining later on this week that we will start to see the beginning of the ascospores. They kind of begin as like a bell curve sort of development. And so right now we're at the very beginning, but that doesn't mean that we aren't getting spores produced. We're just not getting a lot of spores produced. And because of that, any of those spores that are released early on become established. And then you get a spot like this. And this is going to allow for secondary infection. And the amazing thing about this spot here or this spot here is there's about, on any given day, 95,000 conidia or single spores on a single lesion. So if we count here, and we're just going to round it up to make it a nice number, we have more than 10. So this leaf alone is capable of producing 1 million spores. If we start trying to spray now, like this grower did at tight cluster, even though there might only be a couple of lesions, we're still behind the 8 ball. So particularly for scab, this is really, really important. But then, you know, what else kind of went wrong here? You know, the last couple of years in particular, we've had a lot of growers contacting me about issues with rust that they haven't had before. So does anyone have any ideas what might be going on here? Is it the same that they didn't spray early enough, or maybe they didn't spray the right something? So actually one of the issues going on with rust is, you know, Captan doesn't work really well on rust. And rust actually really starts to come in later on. And one of the interesting things, Rally is excellent for rust, but, you know, Sovereign, not so much. And if I go down, let me see over to this slide, here. And like I said, I wasn't going to be doing the normal linear talk and bouncing around. What you can see is that here on Sovereign, and I hope some of you can see, I know it's going to be really small. I guess maybe, Karen, can you guys see if I make it like this? Is that easier to see? What I'm trying to show here is that actually a fungicide like Sovereign is actually only suppressive for rust. So Raleigh is doing a lot of your heavy lifting for your rust control. And it could be what you're actually seeing, going back to the spray schedule, and now I'm going to have to reduce it, is that the Raleigh might have been a little on the late side to get that rust control in here. And here was too early, and this just wasn't timed well. So that might be what's going on. Obviously, there's lots of things that could be going on, and it's hard to always be able to see. So just to go back again, copper would be a great addition early on at Silvertip, because that would actually help against fire blight, which for whatever reason this grower so far isn't having a problem with. But it would also help with scab. It would also actually, if they were probably to put another application on earlier with maybe something like Captan to help control scab, and then switching over to Mancozeb or Zyram earlier would give better control against rust, because Sovereign is only suppressive. Captan doesn't really work well against rust.
What are your thoughts on Excalibur?
On which one? Excalia, that's a great question. So if you go and open up the fruit guide, we changed the format, and we're going to ask you for some input on that. And so based on the data that we have, it actually is considered to be an excellent performer. This year, Tristan and I, we actually got funding through the IR4, and we're going to put the SDHI fungicides head to head in a trial to see what works best. We tried to do this last year, and our outcome was similar to yours. On May 9th, we lost our crop, so it's kind of hard to evaluate things. Hopefully that won't happen again, but based on what's in the literature, Escalia, as you can see here, was considered excellent for controlling scab. So that would be a great product. That's a FRAC code 7. It's a newer product, so it's probably going to be a little expensive. So Melanie asked what Captan formulation is sanctioned for organic use, and there is no organic formulation for Captan. I believe the confusion for that is Captan is sometimes referred to as an organic chemistry, which is how chemists use the term, in that it has carbon atoms, but it is not organic as far as the organic industry uses it. So there is no organic farming Captan. I hope that clarifies things. So sometimes when we look at these spray schedules, it's very easy to pick apart different things that are applied and where things might be improved, but it's also important to think about how the fungicides are actually used. And so a fungicide like Captan or Zyram or Mancozeb, you know, that one's kind of like a coat of paint, and you want to make sure that you cover the plant so that you actually provide the protection that you need. One of the reasons a fungicide like Excalia is more expensive is it's somewhat translaminar, meaning wherever it lands, it goes through to the underside of the leaf surface. It doesn't spread out, but it goes through. And then there's our systemic fungicides, and by this I mean Raleigh, some of the other SDHIs that you see in Maravon or Luna Sensation. Aprovia is a limited systemic. So these, one of the reasons they're more expensive is they don't just have to hit here, because obviously when we put a spray on, we get little beads of water everywhere. And so it's impossible to get that sheeting action and really get perfect coverage. And this is where a systemic fungicide, which penetrates and moves through the plant, provides an improved performance. So when we go here and look at this, most of our protectant fungicides, if you see here, you'll see that, I'm trying to cover that up, you'll see that M, and that means it's a multi-site, it's a protectant. You see that for Captan, Furbam, Roper, or any mancozeb product. If we were talking tree fruit, that would be chlorothalonil as well. Whereas our other fungicides, we have these different FRAC codes, and our FRAC 3s are generally systemic. Our FRAC 11s are translaminar. Sometimes they're systemic. One of the things to also keep in mind when we're looking at this is, you know, looking at the labels and seeing how much you can use and in what ratio or what dilution you can use. You know, a lot of these labels were written when growers had really large trees and that pound per acre was put in 400 gallon volume to cover it. And some people say, you know, you just want to do a quick, you know, divide by 4 to make it like 100 gallons so you know how much you need to apply. Air blast sprayers, you know, generally you're looking at tanks that are 20 to 40 gallon. So you want to be careful and make sure that you are applying the appropriate amount and not just assume that any set rate is appropriate. You want to make sure the trees are covered and what you have covered works for the acreage. And we have a whole section of this on tree row volumes, and we can talk about that if somebody wants to come back to do that. I'm gonna just look right over here and see. So Sid asked about spraying Captan and copper too close together. And actually Captan and copper too close isn't a huge problem. One of the issues with Captan, and don't you love autocorrect? Captan always gets corrected into Captain. So it drives me nuts. You don't want to spray copper and oil too close together. You don't want to spray Captan and oil too close together. But and then one of the issues with Captan is you want to make sure that your water is slightly acidified, so that could create problems with your copper. But if you were just using them by yourself with most of the water in Indiana having a pH above 8, that shouldn't be a problem. But that's also one of the reasons you want to apply an acidifier, because you want to get that pH down a little bit. At a pH of 8, your Captan will hydrolyze in about 20 minutes. So that means for most of us, by the time you mix up the Captan and get out to spray, you've lost half of the activity of the Captan. And within an hour, you've lost, you know, 3/4 of the activity. So if not more, 7/8 actually. So Melanie wanted to know how soon after dormant can you apply oil, or after dormant can you apply copper? Generally, we say 10 days to 2 weeks. A lot of that depends on weathering and it depends on temperature. So that's one of your miles may vary. As for sulfur, I don't know. We don't use a lot of sulfur around the orchards here, so you might need to check with other publications. I don't know people who use too much sulfur and oil together on tree fruit. So really quick, I guess before we jump ahead, do we have any other questions about using the tables here? I guess one of the things I want to point out is we have a grower who's having problems with scab rust, fly speck, rots, and russet. And one of the things that I like about this format here, and I'm curious as to what you think about it, is here we can look at something like a Provia, or and we can compare it, say, to Excalia, who somebody asked about. And what you can see here is a Provia is actually considered to provide fair performance against summer rots, whereas Excalia, it isn't considered to be very good. But if you don't have a problem with summer rots, that doesn't matter. If scab is a big problem, both the Provia and Excalia are excellent against scab. We don't have any data regarding how they perform against rust. Other SDHI, FRAC 7 fungicides have performed well, but we just don't have the data right now because these are new fungicides. Hopefully we'll get that soon. Powdery mildew. Let's say you have a lot of Jonathan in your orchard. I keep noticing more and more Honeycrisp with a powdery mildew problem. You might actually prefer Excalia to Aprovia because it performs better. And then, you know, one of the biggies is bitter rot. And this is where it gets kind of interesting, because on the label, you'll see that bitter rot is considered, or Aprovia is considered suppressive. And here you can see that I have data which my colleagues provided to me from North Carolina and Georgia, where they had really good results using Aprovia to control bitter rot. So I suspect over time that label will change, but if I were this grower and I was going to invest, and with bitter rot being the problem that it is, I would be leaning more towards Aprovia than, say, Excalia. I would also, instead of using just Sovereign, maybe looking at Flint, or going, if you scroll farther down in the spray guide, you could see Luna Sensation or Maravon. All are really good. Sevia is a new FRAC 3, and maybe using that instead of Raleigh. Again, a lot of that depends upon fungicide resistance issues, which we don't have a lot of data here because this is a new grower. And first we want to make sure they're using the fungicides correctly before we jump the gun and start assuming that they're actually dealing with issues of fungicide resistance. So I'm going to just ask a quick question to see if everybody's awake here and paying attention. And I will answer some questions in the chat. We have the survey there. So the guide is available online and can be ordered through the extension store. And I will leave that for hopefully Karen or Peter or someone to put in for me. If not, I promise to put the link in at the very end. I guess I need to put down if protectant fungicides work as a barrier or not. I'm hoping everybody else put their answer in, because the answer is true.
So we did have 89% respond with true.
Awesome. And for those of you who, you know, responded with false, I just want to reiterate some of the ways to think about this. It is really like a coat of paint, and if you don't have that barrier down, you're not going to get the protection. So, and don't worry, there'll be other questions. So at the very end, everybody will get a gold star, I promise. So here's a lot of what we actually covered, but just to recapitulate, as many growers said, we could start with using copper here. That would be my preference, but let's face it, not everybody has the same budget for fungicides. We're not golf courses. So if you wanted to save some money, Xyrem, believe it or not, does actually provide some help. Not just with scab, but it has been shown to actually help with some bacterial diseases. I don't know if it helps with fire blight or not, but really the big problem here is scab, and Xyrem is going to do a better job even than copper is. So there's an option. And then coming up with a second spray at 1/2-inch green, not just silver tip. And then going through for tight cluster, Raleigh's a great fungicide. We don't know if there's resistance. If they want to stick with Sovereign, they could stick with Sovereign, but we're going to get rid of the Captan right now, because this is like the period of time where we're getting into crazy tank mixes, and we don't want to end up possibly causing any sort of russet issue. So I'm going to see if I can minimize this. No, of course not. So we'll put this over here. And then we're going to switch over to using Captan. You know, you might be waiting too long if you don't apply anything. A couple years ago, Tristan and I tried to do a trial dealing with some of the post-harvest rots, particularly bitter rot, because a lot of growers were having problems. And we picked our apples. We had done treatments like the day before with Captan and Maravon and I think Pageant and nothing. And we quickly picked the apples and put them into storage. And then we started counting apples to see how much rot we got. And we got nothing in anything. So everything worked well, which tells me that if you pick your apples and store them quickly, you may not have a problem with bitter rot. If you can't store them quickly. We'll probably do that experiment again. And I suspect using Captan, Pageant, or Maravon, you could do those up to the day of harvest, and that would actually give you some better quality apples when they are in storage. Another option would be adding Xyram or copper, switching over to Aprovia. This is not a cheap fungicide, so what you can do is make your own 7-11 fungicide, and here's Flint Extra, which is the new formulation of Flint. And you can mix Aprovia in, and then you could apply it early and then use it as a 7-11 later on. You need to be careful about the pre-harvest interval because it's 30 days, but by second cover, you'll have plenty of time. Here we've also included some Topsin, just because of fly speck being an issue. In my experience, most of the growers who regularly apply fungicides regularly don't have a problem, and it's the growers who try to reduce applications or something happens and they just don't get it on in the summer. They're the ones who have fly speck and sooty blotch problems. Here's a third option, which I'm sure many people know. I'm a big proponent of Captazeb or Captoram, which would just be using Captan and Xyram instead of Captan and Mancozeb or Pencozeb. I like this because the Captan will move if you have a little bit of misty rain and redistribute. The Xyram or Pencozeb or Roper or whatever trade name Mancozeb you're using actually is more rain resistant. Note here we added the LI 700 because we know we have problems with alkaline water. Our water can get to be as high as 9 by August. So here I actually thought that if this were me and I was doing it, I would up the ante and use some Indar or Inspire plus Xyram. This will give you much more intrinsic control of scab than you would get from Raleigh. The downside is it doesn't control powdery mildew very well, but here you can see that we don't have a powdery mildew problem. So I'm not going to worry about that until it is. Keeping both applications of Strep, talk about that a little bit more, and then putting Maravon here at the very end to help with crop preservation and also to help control the rots and the fly speck. So just a reminder, because a lot of growers have moved away from using Raleigh because of resistance, fungicide resistance in the scab population. We are also seeing some of that fungicide resistance with powdery mildew, and I'm getting more and more concerned because we're having so many problems with Honeycrisp. This is a photo I took at one of our Indiana orchards this last summer. That's white, and it's not white because of any fungicide. That's just all powdery mildew. And because we didn't get below -11 this year, most of our powdery mildew was able to overwinter in our buds. And so we really want to make sure we get that fungicide on, particularly these DMI fungicides that are so effective against powdery mildew. And so when we're looking at powdery mildew activity, Raleigh, until we know otherwise, is still really good. Really hope we aren't dealing with any fungicide resistance issues here. TopGuard is better though. It's not as good against scab as say Indar or Inspire, but it is better on powdery mildew. As far as, this is old data, so I've never been a fan of Fineramol. Again, this is one of your mileages, may vary. Teb is much better against scab, and you could probably split the difference here. Scab might be the C+ for everything, which means it isn't the best student in any one thing, but it doesn't flunk in any area either. So these are some things to keep in mind. Also keep in mind that you want to use something other than these fungicides. DMIs and sooty blotch fly speck, we've tried doing some trials with that. Every so often we'll get a result in a colleague where they had great activity and we're still not quite sure what's going on. But I'm not convinced that these two provide really good sooty blotch fly speck control. compared to the FRAC 11 or the 711 groups of fungicide. And by that, I mean your Flint, your Sovereign, your Pristine, your Luna Sensation, and your Maravon. That was a lot of information. Even my parrot is not happy about that. He's really not happy about that. So here you can see when we're talking about that last problem here, trying to manage sooty blotch, based on the data, people are saying that Inspire gives really good control. The trials where that happened, there were a lot of fungicides being applied and they weren't controlled for different products, and I'm not sure that's entirely true. Maybe that's something we'll be able to figure out in the future. Luna has been great, Maravon has been great, Pristine has been great. Some other fungicides that have been shown to give really good control, SCHI, and this is a new one, Miravis. We'll be having that in our trial as well. Completely different FRAC code right here is Omega, also has some ability to control sooty blotch and fly speck. So that was a lot, and I'm really pleased to say we made it 35 minutes, and we're only finished the first case study. So I might go farther than I had hoped, but I'm not going to finish my talk today, so I'm happy. So we're going to go to our next quiz, and this is just kind of to break things up and give our brain a rest after that huge cluster right there. So I guess before I jump ahead, I have a study, I have one study left, and I'll just poll you guys, and if you could tell me if you want to work at this scab problem here, if you want to work on this rot problem here, if you'd like to go over this fire blight problem here, or if you'd like to talk about this crown rot problem here. So for those of you not familiar with rot, if you live in Indiana long enough and work in apples, you will become very familiar with rot, unfortunately. I think all of us are more familiar with rot than we would like to be. So these two here, you're looking at black rot. Over here, you can actually see white rot. And here we have my personal favorite, bitter rot. And here you can see some of the cankering that occurs due to this same fungus here, the black rot pathogen. So what we are actually going to focus on, though, is trying to control bitter rot, which is this problem right here. And here is what this grower actually used. So here you can see, I'm going to try and, yeah. They started off with a different approach, and there's absolutely nothing wrong with different. They started spraying at green tip, and they used Vanguard, and then they switched over at tight cluster to Inspire Super. And at bloom, they ended up using, Strep, and they have 3 applications of Strep between first bloom and petal fall, which could explain why they have such great fire blight control. Here you can see back-to-back Inspire Super, which is a little unusual, but it's not off the label, totally allowed. And then they come through with some Topsin and Captan. Anybody want to comment on what they notice with this schedule here? What I can do is share some of the fungicide labels. I don't know if that helps. Here you can see Aprovia. Here we can see Maravon. David said Topsin alone is not recommended. Thank you, David. That is so absolutely true. Topsin alone isn't recommended because of the risk of resistance. It's really, really high. In fact, we actually did some survey work a very long time ago when I first got here, and we found most of the apple orchards, all of the scab was actually resistant to Topsin. We did start looking at some of the bitter rot, and a lot of the bitter rot, it depends, because even though this all looks like bitter rot, it turns out they actually have cryptic species, and I think we had like 4 or 5 different species that all look the same to the naked eye. but it turns out they were different, and so we had different results. So it was kind of hard to figure out what was going on, but we do have resistance, and again, a lot of topsin not rotating, so excellent catch there. How about trying to control bitter rot with Inspire? What you see is that even though Inspire Super is great for scab, it's great for, you know, some of the sooty blotch and fly specks, supposedly, it's wonderful on rust. It helps with Brooks' spot, which I've not seen here, but once or twice, actually. It isn't labeled for bitter rot. So the reliance on Inspire by this grower is a problem. Another potential problem, let's see, we have Flint, and we can see that it's labeled for scab and for the rusts, but it's only suppressive here for bitter rot. So not the best choice, even though it's controlling a lot of other problems. Something to keep in mind, you know, we talked about getting copper on at that dormant spray, and that's great. And if you can do it, that's awesome. But, you know, all of us have lives, and unfortunately, we're all held victim to the weather. And sometimes it's just too wet and you can't get out there. And so spraying something later is, you know, not a bad thing. I think this grower has helped themselves a lot by following up with Inspire, kind of as a cleanup lap at this stage. But some things that I would actually talk about recommending is, you know, maybe going and using something like Aprovia, even though it's expensive, because it does have really good control for the summer rots. But there are other products here that you can use. One of the biggest issues to keep in mind, though, and this is where Aprovia is a bit of a problem, is that 30-day PHI, is you're probably not going to use it past your 6th or 7th cover, depending on what kind of apple you're growing. Some of the better products I would recommend, once again, and I'm going to sound like a broken record, but the data shows Maravon and Pristine as two of the better products for controlling bitter rot. So that would be something to actually keep in mind. I think more important is, I'm going to just jump over here before I go back, is similar to what David brought up, is making sure you have that tank in there. Captan and Mancozeb, whatever form you have, Roper, Pencozeb, Manzate, is really, really important early on. One of the things that we found from our trials previously, and that was repeated at other states last year who didn't lose their crop unlike us, is these early applications turned out to be a lot more important than they realized. And in fact, we had 30%, almost 40% higher bitter rot when we didn't use some of these fungicides until after petal fall. So I want to say that again. Not using Captan or Mancozeb before petal fall increased the risk of bitter rot, regardless of what was used after petal fall. So that means that the pathogen that is causing bitter rot is infecting earlier than we thought. We used to think that it didn't start infecting until now, and in fact, we pretty much are trying to cobble together the data to show that it's actually infecting as early as half-inch green, tight cluster, maybe even earlier. So please keep that in mind. Another option, you know, topsin hasn't been the best lately. Some growers have been using Captan, and they've actually been using it with Prophyte at a very high rate, and we have that in the spray guide. So, and that's been shown to improve performance. I've mentioned LI 700. Phil Brannon at Georgia has gotten the same results that we've gotten using LI 700 and improving quality. Using Pencozeb or Roper early on is really important, but not using Captan during bloom is really important. And this is the crazy tank mix time, and we want to make sure we don't end up russeting our apples or damaging our blooms. And unfortunately, we have had growers do that because, you know, I just have the fungicides here. We also have all of the insecticides. And when you mix Captan, and if there's an oil in another fungicide or an insecticide, you'll end up creating your own herbicide, and that would be pretty bad. So let's go really quick here. You know, I was joking about this. I think I finished this talk close to 11 last night. So I was like, think about it. PHI, if I can make you think about it, I would be really happy. One of the reasons I recommend using at 8th cover and up to harvest Captan Maravon is because of that 0-day PHI. Pristine is there as well. So that's one of the reasons I push that more than say like a Luna Sensation. So with that, just gonna ask Karen to put up a poll to find out if you prefer having the REI and PHI information on the table, or if you don't. Maybe it's too much information, which it is a lot of information, that's for sure. One of the things I try to explain to the people I work with who don't grow apples, whether they're academics, administrators, other scientists, is how much stuff you guys have to try and manage, and it's incredible. And so I'm just trying to figure out ways to make it easier for you. And if this isn't it, please let me know. Okay, good. So, and for the person who thinks it doesn't help them, please contact me, shoot me an email, and we can figure out how we can maybe, you know, do things. I definitely am open to suggestions. All right. So here is a really comprehensive schedule. I think this is a really awesome schedule, quite honestly. And based on a real live grower as opposed to a real dead grower. But so here we can see, you know, they start off early on, they have their copper down, they're using Vanguard, they're tank mixing it just like you would like. They come in with a cleanup with Indar. They're getting really good control of everything except crown rot. So here's our picture of crown rot. This was a photo taken by Alan Biggs, and here you can see the actual, you know, different tree where the crown has been cut away, so you can see what's going on there. Had a lot of problems last year with a number of growers, some of which had problems with crown rot. This is Indiana. We have a lot of heavy clay, and we did have a bit of flooding, but I think the worst of the flooding happened the previous year. And so we didn't see the symptoms until the following year, which is a problem. We can't control the weather, but we can control how we respond to it. So what would people like to actually do? One thing I want to stress from some of what I saw last year, and you can see these spray strips underneath the tree, is you really want to make sure you're keeping the weeds down. One of the problems that several growers had last year was that the weeds got to be really high, and part of that could have been because of flooding, and that made it hard to get into the orchard to actually spray. And when they finally did, they had to put on a lot more herbicide, and they ended up getting drift to the crown, and it caused cankering. And that injury serves as an infection court for Phytophthora, which is what causes the crown rot. So if you go into the Midwest Fruit Pest Management Guide, what we did this year, and we've had that previous years, we just set the format up a little differently, is we added crown rot in here and what to do. And we tried to put all the information here on the same page. One of the things you really need to keep in mind is the label has been clarified. For a long time, it was not made clear, and I think they got called into accounting on this. And that the pre-harvest interval for using Ridimol Gold, which is labeled for crown rot, is 1 year if it's a bearing apple. So you can use it for non-bearing apples, but you cannot use it on bearing apples. So then what is a grower to do if you have crown rot starting in your orchard and you need to manage it, but you also want to make sure you keep your crop? So one of the things would be Ridimil as a drench, but then you can't eat those apples for that year or sell those apples. The other thing you can do, and I guess I didn't save the right version or not, is using a product called Rampart. And let me see if I can pull that up here. Hopefully you guys can see. Yes. Okay, so this is the label for Rampart. I guess I'm gonna scroll you through the whole thing here. So this is Rampart. This is a recent label, 2015. And what you can do is when you get to apple here, you can actually use this as a foliar application. So this would be your best bet, for trying to manage, since we don't live in New York, manage this problem. So that's kind of a change that we tried to update the guide to include. Not one that, you know, any of us really wanted to see, but it is what it is. This is a workaround that you can apply Rampart foliar application. You will get good control. One of the interesting things about Rampart and this group of fungicides is the fact that it is truly systemic. It's amphimobile, meaning it goes into the xylem, it goes through the phloem, and by applying it to the foliage, it will translocate down into the roots. So we have a question about what about fire blight affecting susceptible rootstocks? Well, that's a really good question. One of the first things I would recommend is using a product like Apogee. We're right now talking about crown rot, so tell you what, let me just take a step back and make sure everyone is clear on the crown rot, and then I promise you and I can talk about fire blight if we want to continue this, and if anyone wants to stay on, we can do that, okay? I just don't want to confuse people with fire blight and crown rot. So as far as crown rot management, if it's a bearing apple, you cannot use Ridamil Gold unless you want to have a 1-year PHI, or I think it's a 364-day PHI. You can use Rampart. There might be other PHIs, or excuse me, other phosphoric acid derivatives besides Rampart. Rampart was the only one that I found that was still labeled for use on bearing apples. Any questions on crown rot? And if not, we can go over to fire blight. Okay, so what I can do is spend the next couple of minutes until Zoom boots us off or whatever, talking about fire blight. I would say I'm going to just jump here to what I would recommend doing in an orchard where I'm using fire blight susceptible rootstocks, is making sure that the trees are treated with something like Apogee to prevent the fire blight from getting in from the shoots to the rootstock. And what Apogee or Kudo, it really is about the same price. Kudo's the generic version. What that does is it reduces the length of the shoot, and it seems to make it more difficult for the bacteria to spread down into the main stem of the tree, into that susceptible rootstock. I would avoid using highly susceptible scions attached to highly susceptible fire blight susceptible rootstocks. So by that, I would say your really dwarf, your M26s, I wouldn't use those attached to something like a Gala or a Ginger Gold or Fuji or Jonathan. I would be really careful about fertilization. I wouldn't because adding fertilizer suppresses the disease resistance and the defense response. So if you add too much fertilizer, you could even make B9 susceptible to fire blight. And so you really want to be careful with that. The next thing you would do is spray strep when the tree is in bloom. You want to do that early on when you see those first blossoms come out. And then you want to follow up 3 to 5 days later. And, you know, as Peter said, in a regular, you know, this is like based, I don't know where, maybe Washington, where everything happens quickly and they don't have crazy weather changes. You know, here our bloom can last a day, which is great for managing fire blight. There's been other times where bloom could last a week or longer if it's really cool. And so you might end up needing 2, 3, or even 4 applications of strep. We recommend using Regulate with that to get better coverage and more protection. Lots of studies have shown that actually. There have been reports of strep resistance. We don't have reports to date that I find credible. So if you are concerned about strep resistance in your orchard, please contact me and we can do what needs to be done to have that tested. If you are using streptomycin responsibly, and by that I mean not spraying it other than during the bloom period. We used to recommend trauma blight sprays, and those really haven't done much except cause resistance. So if you were to follow a protocol like this, and please look in the spray guide because we have more information on apogee there, and we have more information on antibiotic resistance. Nobody's going to remember what it is I'm talking about here, which is why we have this stuff written up in the guide to help you remember. We also have this stuff written up in the guide, you know, where it needs to be. So you can see here we have, you know, during bloom, using agromycin. Here we have using apogee. If it were to be strep resistance, which we have not seen here, we have what's needed for Cassumin. Should you go out and use Cassumin anyway? Well, it's about 6 times more expensive than strep, so not unless you need to, in my book. Some people recommend using MicaShield and rotating MicaShield and streptomycin. This is an oxytetracycline, an OTC. That's possible. It would take the pressure off strep. I would say OTC is not as good as strep. So keep in mind that you are increasing your risk of infection slightly during that time. So maybe if you have any outbreaks going on, this might not be something you want to do. But this comes down to, you know, how you use your antibiotics and your values if you want to spend the extra money to do that rotation with the hope that you will minimize the risk of resistance. That's the cost benefit right there. So any other questions on that?
Can we clarify the Ridimol Gold label? If it was my understanding that in years past you could put it on bearing trees, but now they clarified and it can no longer be put on bearing trees?
So yes, that's a good question. So in years past, they didn't clarify anything, which was the problem. It was not explicitly stated that you couldn't use it. The PHI for apples wasn't listed, the pre-harvest interval, and now they do have it on the label. So that's the difference.
Thank you.
All right. Well, thanks again, Janna, for joining us, and we'll go ahead and sign out. I've got your email there about the CCA, so I will follow up with you on that. Thank you.
Thank you.